G'day folks, welcome back. In this video I'm going to get started on the combat rules. I'm going to start by going through the attack phase sequence. Now I've already explained movement and prepared attacks. The first thing you do in the attack phase sequence is remove any superfluous prepared attack markers. These are any PA markers that are pointing at empty spaces. You just remove those. Once you've done that, the second step is to place white attack markers to indicate all units that will attack during this combat phase. So you place these white markers throughout all the attacks that you want to take place before any actual attacks happen. Once you've placed all those white attack markers, you then resolve those attacks one at a time. And of course, once you've started, you can't then add subsequent or additional attack markers. You list them all first, and then you go through one at a time in the order you want. The one kind of little exceptional rule there is that attacks on 2 hex units must take place simultaneously. Now the basic rules for combat are pretty straightforward and common. Each hex can only be attacked once per combat phase. Obviously, to engage in combat, the attacking units have to be stacked adjacent to the hex being attacked. The attacker can only attack one hex at a time, except in the case of 2 hex units which have to be attacked simultaneously, both hexes at the same time. Again, I'll explain that in a moment. Units from different hexes can of course combine to attack a single defender in a hex, provided they are within the same core. Now in short, as I said earlier, units attached to different core can't combine when attacking or defending within a hex. And it's important to keep in mind here that independent units attached to an army each count as separate core for the purposes of this rule. A force has to attack as a single entity. However, you can have potentially different forces stacked in the same hex, and those different forces can attack different hexes, different defenders in different areas. And just to cover sort of things I've gone over earlier, but basically combat ineffective and demoralised units cannot initiate an attack. Units with an attack strength of 0 cannot attack, and you cannot attack across the Danao River nor impassable mountain hex sides. Now within each attack, the attacker begins by identifying the attacking hexes, and then the defending hex or again hexes if it's a 2 hex unit. You then reveal all the defending units or attacking and defending units in all those hexes. Once that's all been revealed, both the attacker and the defender determine if any of their units in those attacking or defending hexes are to be withheld. And units can be withheld for a range of reasons, such as if they're in excess of combat stacking limits, which I've explained in the past, if there are units of different core stacked together, and of course only the units of one core contribute to sort of each combat. You can't mix the core together. Now, any combat ineffective or demoralised defenders can decide to be withheld from the combat if they are stacked in a hex with effectively combat effective units. So as long as there are some units in that hex that can defend, those combat ineffective and disordered units can be withheld. Other than that, any other healthy effective units in the hex must contribute to the defence up to that combat stacking unit level. Any in excess of that stacking level can be, of course, withheld. Now, any attackers that are withheld basically play no part in combat. They're not affected by combat results, and they cannot advance after combat. Defenders, however, any defenders in that hex that are withdrawn, either voluntarily or involuntarily, they are only affected by retreat results on the combat results table and by an efficiency check failure from those other defending units, and then only if their hex is totally vacated by all those other participating defenders in the combat. So it's only if those defenders that participated in the combat all retreated but those with the held units would have to retreat, and they only retreat the minimum required, the smallest retreat obligation in the combat. They're not required to perform an efficiency check, and they'll only suffer combat effectiveness reductions if they retreat through an enemy zone of control, which I'll cover in just a moment. So you make the determination, and then both players check their supply for the combat to see if they can receive ammo, and the Serbian unit checks to see if they can receive shells. Now for the Serbian player, this basically means that they start the campaign scenario with 125 shells, and if they can draw supply, they can provide shells for the combat, which means the combat is fought as normal. If they don't provide those shells, they have an artillery value of 0, which I'll explain the effects of that in just a moment. And in short, basically one shell spent provides supplies one force with that artillery value, and the same when defending. One shell spent allows one defending force and one neighbouring force to use their artillery value. Now, when units check for ammo, they all need ammo to participate fully in combat, and they need to draw supply from a supply source along an eligible supply path to receive that ammunition. And I'll go over those supply rules at a later stage, but basically you're drawing supply to mainly the army depot, the big army depot, or the particular core train for that unit. And those, of course, also have to be in supply, and I'll go through that later. Now, if you provide ammo, you fight at full strength. If you cannot draw that ammo, those units have their combat strength and artillery value both halved. Now, from that point on, it's a pretty standard combat resolution. Both players add up their combat strength. You consider the combat strengths of forces participating, adjusting for ammo supply and any terrain effects, keeping in mind that terrain can reduce the attacker's strength and so forth. You determine the odds ratio by dividing the attacker's strength by the defense strength. And unlike many other war games, this is not just a round down odds ratio. You check the range of your ratio, and you go to, well, this is all on the column on the combat results table, but it's a little more complex than most odds ratios. So, for example, a 14-4 odds ratio would normally, in most other combat war games, round down to 3-1. It's 3.5, you'd round out to 3-1, but in Serbien Muss Sterbien, 3.5 actually rounds up to 4-1 because it's within that 4-1 range. In fact, the 4-1 range goes from 3.5 all the way up to 4.99. And then odds ratios of 5 to 6.99 round to 6.1. So it complicates things a little bit. You have to do a little bit more math than you normally would, but it creates some interesting results. Now, the attackers can also gain a convenient flanked bonus. To gain this flank bonus, they need to basically surround the defender, have most of the hexes around the defender surrounded. They need to have a combined size of attacking units greater than or equal to the size of the defending units. And they also need to either occupy by both attacking units and units friendly to the attacker, or have hexes in the zones of control of the attacking units. The one thing that isn't counted in surrounding this are the zones of control of units friendly to the attacker but not taking part in that combat. The hexes occupied by those non-attacking but friendly units is counted, but not the zones of control of those non-attacking units. That's a little bit complicated, but I hope it makes sense. Now, flank attacks grant 2 column shifts to the right, so it's quite a good bonus. There are also column shifts for things like prepared attacks. As I mentioned in, I think, the second video, a prepared attack grants 1 column shift to the right if all attacking units have a PA marker. It has to be all those. An improved position grants 1 column shift to the left, beneficial to the defender. Terrain, such as major river, bottomland with river, Sava Island, Sava Riverbend, grants 1 column shift to the left, helping the defender if all attacking units are attacking across such a hex side. The Sava River itself grants 2 column shifts to the left if all attacking units are attacking across it. And if at least one attacking unit is attacking across the Sava River, there is at least 1 shift to the left. And if the attacker is attacking up elevation, there is 1 column shift to the left if all attacking units are attacking basically uphill. Now, once you've determined that the column to use, both players state, starting with the attacker, what intensity their units will fight with. The attacker says, effectively, I'm not fighting intensely, or they are fighting intensely. And then the defender makes a determination. They say not intense or intense. And the combination of those two is checked with what's called the combat intensity matrix to determine the overall battle intensity, which ranges from low, attacker intense, defender intense, or high intensity. And that has an influence on the battle outcomes, whether or not there are the extent of the retreats. If there are retreats, strength losses, things like that, it affects it shapes the final outcome. With that done, the attacker then rolls 1 white and 1 black die. They consult the combat results table. They modify that final result of the white die by the PR difference on the 2 counters. And then you check that final result on the CRT to get the combat result. Now, when applying that proficiency rating or PR shift, you basically subtract the highest attacking unit's proficiency rating from the highest defending unit's proficiency rating, and you basically modify that white die by the either positive or negative dice roll modifier that you get. Now, when looking at the results on the combat results table, the number to the left, or the result on the left of that slash, applies to the attacker. And this is the dice roll modifier for the post-combat efficiency check. You'll need to remember that number for a subsequent phase of combat procedures. The number to the right, or the result to the right, affects the defender. And again, this is typically a dice roll modifier for the post-combat efficiency check. And it may include a black or white circled number, which may mean the defender suffers a retreat and a strength loss, or the attacker may suffer a retreat and a strength reduction. With that done, you conduct any retreats, apply any combat effective level penalties or strength reductions. Now, if you're in a combat with a relatively small enemy force, an enemy force that is less than 1 division equivalent, you don't automatically apply the results from the combat results table. You then apply what's called a small magnitude modification. This is basically saying that, well, this would normally be a result, but if you're fighting a smaller force, you may reduce the impact that they've done. In those cases where you've suffered a result against less than a division sized enemy, or a division equivalent sized enemy, you roll a d6 on this table and you cross-reference that with the size of the enemy's force. And after rolling that die, if the result you rolled matches those numbers appearing on the table, you suffer the result as normal. If the number you rolled does not appear on the table, then you don't suffer that result. Now that combat resolution is performed in full. You conduct retreats, apply those combat losses, the strengths and so forth. Once you've done all that, then you determine the total artillery value. Each player determines their total artillery value, and they check this against the number of division equivalents that their opponent has participating in that combat. You cross-reference this on the artillery table to determine your artillery dice roll modifier. Now, when determining the artillery dice roll modifier on this artillery table, the attacker basically adds up the sum of all their attacking units' artillery values. This is the number to the left of the counter in the middle. The defender adds up all their defending units' artillery values, and any neighbouring units' artillery values. Those neighbouring units have to be adjacent to the defending hex and also adjacent to one of the attackers that were on that hex. And that basically lend their support to that combat. Those neighbouring units, of course, have to be in the same core as well. And it should be noted as well that a unit can only add its artillery value to one combat per phase. So if those neighbouring units supported one combat below them, they can't then add their artillery value to a combat just above them as well. It can only be one contribution per combat phase in its entirety. And the third step is then to determine what's called a post-combat effectiveness check. Both players do this for their units. They roll separately for each stack. You apply modifiers such as those that you derive from the combat results table, the artillery dice roll modifier that you've just drawn from your opponent's artillery value, and you add a modifier if the defender was flanked. Again, you consult this little table and you apply the effects, which again can be a reduction in combat effectiveness, a retreat, or a strength reduction. There are various effects throughout the game that force units to suffer strength reductions. Typically this will be from the combat results table. It may be from forced march efficiency check failure, the post-combat efficiency check failure, and sometimes due to retreats. So units will be forced to take what are called strength reductions. Now, generally, such as in combat, when a stack is forced to take a strength reduction, it is only one counter in that stack, not the entire stack that suffers one each. And when that stack must suffer, the particular unit that suffers that reduction must be chosen in the following sort of priority. The first priority should be a formation unit that has not yet reached its maximum number of strength reductions. And the maximum there for those division size units is -4. So you're typically going straight to formations first. Once they are at their maximum, you then look to full strength asset units assigned to a formation that actually have a flipped or reduced side. The third step is then any asset unit not assigned to a formation. And in dire circumstances, if all your formations have -4 strength reduction, if all your assets have been flipped to their reduced side, or if after all that no other units can be flipped because they have no reduced side, then you record a strength reduction by recording the loss of a replacement. And this is all tracked on your resources track. If you can go to negative replacements, so you can go -1, -2 if you're doing really poorly, and that simply means that the next lot of replacements will subtract that number from what you should receive. Okay, so retreat can be caused as a result on the CRT table or because of a post-combat efficiency check. Retreats are always resolved in number of hexes, not by movement points. So you ignore the movement costs of terrain. Of course, you can't retreat across the Danube River, and you can't retreat across impassable mountain hexes. When retreating, you need to retreat the maximum distance from the enemy. You have to stay within your army area of attachment, and you should retreat towards a supply unit from which that unit, the retreating unit, is eligible to receive supply. Now they're the priorities, but when retreating, you can choose a path to avoid enemy zones of control, or a path with the fewest zones of control, even if that would violate the priority to stay within your area of attachment or to retreat towards a supply source. So you can move further away from those if you're avoiding enemy zones of control in the process. Now there are a few special cases. Any asset units stacked with a formation have to retreat with the formation they're assigned to. They can't change direction or change assignment until all those retreats have been completed. Any depot units stacked with units that must retreat are displaced. They're basically removed from the map and they fly to a friendly operational railroad line hex and are flipped to their backside. And fort units, any fort units forced to retreat are flipped to their backside and then retreated. And 2 hex units. If 1 hex of a 2 hex unit receives a retreat result, that 2 hex unit can either consolidate into 1 or it can wheel around just to satisfy that 1 hex. If the entire 2 hex unit is forced to retreat, or if there is a multi-hex retreat, the individual hex that suffered the retreat result must retreat the full distance, while the other must retreat the number of hexes required to consolidate in the last hex of the retreat. Now, as I said, when retreating you can avoid enemy zones of control, but if for some reason you can't, or you decide not to, for each hex in an unnegated enemy zone of control that a stack retreats into, you immediately reduce the combat effectiveness of all forces in the stack by 1 status level. That is for every force, in the stack. Now, if for some reason a unit retreats across an unbridged Sava River hex side, it suffers a strength reduction and a combat effectiveness level reduction as well. And I also mentioned in an earlier video, if for some reason a unit cannot satisfy their retreat obligations due to prohibited terrain or enemy units, they suffer 1 combat effectiveness level reduction and strength reduction for each hex that it fails to retreat. Now, when an isolated unit, an isolated force, is unable to retreat, or if they must retreat into an enemy zone of control and they're demoralized, or they'll become demoralized due to that retreat, they surrender and are permanently eliminated. Often due to those retreats, the defender's hex will be vacated, and if that is the case, due to a CRT result or a failed post-combat check, the attacker can advance into the vacated hex, and all combat and artillery units may advance after combat. Now, of course, the defender can never advance after a combat they've participated in. And that's about it for combat and retreat. So in the next and final video, I will cover supply, reinforcements, and a few other minor rules.